In the previous episode, Leif, a young Viking who grew up in a simple village, discovered that he was the heir to a lost kingdom called Jarnvik. His journey began when he found a mysterious artifact, accompanied by an ancient scroll that guided him to a golden compass. Following the signs of this magical object, Leif found Jarnvik, a majestic city, hidden and surrounded by mystery. By placing a majestic crown on its head, he brought the city and its people back to life, and was recognized as the king of prophecies, destined to bring prosperity to the kingdom. In his first weeks as king, Leif dedicated himself to learning the customs, forging friendships, and rebuilding the spirit of the people. However, his peace was threatened by rumors of an army of Viking barbarians approaching to attack Jarnvik. Dawn in Jarnvik brought an air of unease. The first light of day illuminated the streets, now vibrant and full of life. Men and women worked in harmony, reinforcing walls, sharpening weapons, and preparing for what seemed like an impending storm. Rumors of a barbarian army had spread like wildfire through the city, and Leif, in his role as the new king, felt the weight of responsibility growing with each passing moment. Leif spent the morning in a meeting with the city's elders and seasoned warriors. They spoke of the size of the enemy army, their brutal tactics, and their family of marauders known for destroying entire villages. "This is not just a matter of defending our home," said one of the elders. "This is a fight for the survival of Jarnvik." Despite the fear, there was also a sense of hope. The arrival of Leif, the king of prophecies, was seen as a sign that the gods were on their side. During the afternoon, while overseeing the preparation of the warriors, Leif noticed that the golden compass he carried began to glow intermittently, emitting a soft light, almost as if it were a warning. Something was coming. He summoned his advisors and shared his observation, but none of them knew how to interpret the phenomenon. "Perhaps it is a sign that the gods wish you to lead this battle with courage," suggested a young skald named Freya, who often narrated the legends of Jarnvik. Late in the day, the silence that reigned in the city was broken by a distant sound: war drums. The residents stopped what they were doing and looked out at the horizon. From one of the observation towers, Leif and his captains saw something that chilled their hearts: an endless line of warriors marching toward the city. Bearing black and red banners, the enemy army moved like a dark tide that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Leif ordered the main gates closed and the archers to take up their positions. He knew that combat was inevitable, but he also understood that the key to victory would be to withstand the first onslaught and find a way to unsettle the enemy. He addressed the Jarnvik warriors, saying, "We are the children of this land, and it has never abandoned us. Today, we will fight not only for Jarnvik, but for all that we are and all that we can be. The gods are with us." As night fell, the enemy army camped a short distance from the walls. The fires they had lit the darkness like the eyes of hungry beasts. Leif watched the camp from the top of the wall, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that the true test of his leadership was just beginning. The fate of Jarnvik and its people lay in his hands. The attack was imminent, and the first spark of battle was about to be lit. In the vast and inhospitable north, beyond the frozen lands of Jarnvik, lay a kingdom marked by brutality and a thirst for conquest. This was the domain of Thrain, the Hammer of the North, a barbarian leader whose name was whispered with fear in distant villages and kingdoms. Thrain had united several barbarian tribes under a bloodstained banner, creating an army feared for its savagery and the cunning that accompanied it. Thrain's army was made up of a diverse array of warriors, each one bringing the essence of their tribes of origin. At the heart of this army were the Sons of Ice, an elite group of fighters who had been trained in the arts of war since childhood. Clad in the skins of wolves and bears, and wielding weapons inscribed with ancient runes, they were the vanguard of any battle, known for their supernatural resistance to cold and ferocity in combat. There were also the Black Blades, a group of assassins and scoundrels who moved like shadows. They were masters of infiltration and sabotage, preparing the ground for the main forces by wreaking havoc among the enemy. Their obsidian daggers were imbued with poisons that caused a slow and painful death. The barbarian cavalry was another crucial element. The Storm Lords, mounted on gigantic mountain horses, were known for their ability to traverse difficult terrain with deadly speed. They carried long spears and shields decorated with the bones of their enemies, instilling fear in anyone who saw them march. Finally, Thrain also had a group known as the Fire Forgers. These were warriors who, in addition to their skill in battle, knew how to shape iron and create incredible weapons and armor. Their swords were said to be tempered in lava and enchanted with ancient spells that amplified their lethality. The people led by Thrain lived a simple but violent life. Their villages were built with wood and stone, surrounded by improvised walls that protected their inhabitants from the ferocious creatures that inhabited the north. Their customs were based on blood rituals and worship of ancient gods, forgotten by other civilizations. Each soldier of Thrain believed that death in battle was the greatest glory they could achieve. Those who showed weakness were eliminated without mercy, reinforcing the idea that only the strongest survived. Their songs and legends were full of heroic deeds and also threats to those who dared to cross their path. The barbarians also practiced a strange type of shamanic magic, where their spiritual leaders, known as oracles of ice, communicated with the spirits of the frozen lands to predict the future or ensure victory in combat. These oracles were respected and feared, their words considered divine orders. Thrain, the supreme leader, was an imposing man whose presence alone was enough to silence a crowd. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, he had muscles that seemed sculpted by ice and a red beard that gave him the appearance of a warrior god. His eyes were cold and calculating, reflecting a strategic mind that belied the brutality of his actions. He was known for his iconic weapon, a gigantic war hammer called Winter's Judgment. The hammer was said to be forged from the metal of a falling star and enchanted by the ice oracles, making it incredibly powerful. With a single blow, Thrain could shatter walls or crush entire armies. Thrain was not only a warrior, he was also a cunning leader who knew how to use fear and diplomacy to his advantage. He had cemented his power by defeating other barbarian leaders in single combat, proving himself the strongest and most worthy to lead. However, his true ambition was to conquer Jarnvik, a land he believed held the key to immortality and eternal glory. Under Thrain's command, the army advanced like a relentless storm, laying waste to everything in its path. The search for Jarnvik was not just a military campaign, but a symbolic act to cement the domination of the North and establish Thrain as a living legend. He knew that the city held secrets that could change the fate of his people and, perhaps, the world. When Thrain discovered that Leif had awakened the Lost Kingdom and claimed the crown of prophecy, he saw in him both an obstacle and an opportunity. To the Hammer of the North, Leif represented the ultimate challenge, and Jarnvik the ultimate prize. And so the barbarian army marched with determination, while the fate of Jarnvik hung in the shadow of an impending war. Thrain's arrival would be not just an attack, but an epic battle that would echo through the ages. The first signs of the siege came at dawn on the first day. The people of Jarnvik awoke to the sound of deafening, rhythmic drumming, echoing off the mountains and across the frozen fields surrounding the city. The walls, still as imposing as they had been in their glory days, were now shadowed by an army that seemed to have no end. Enemy camps had been erected along the horizon, their fires lighting the night like fallen stars, and banners bearing the barbarian emblem fluttered in the icy wind. Thrain and his commanders used fear as their first weapon. They did not attack directly, but made a point of demonstrating power. Great bonfires were lit, and the troops performed strange rituals, shouting and singing war songs in their native tongue. As night fell, the sounds of metal being forged and hammered echoed, suggesting the construction of weapons and siege engines. The people of Jarnvik, still trying to adjust to the city's rebirth, were gripped by fear. Many had celebrated Leif's arrival as a miracle, but now they wondered if the new king would be able to protect them. Families locked themselves in their homes, and some whispered about how the kingdom could survive such an overwhelming force. With each passing day, the siege grew more oppressive. Thrain ordered his troops to march around the city, like predators circling their prey. He sent small groups to attack caravans that attempted to enter or leave, cutting off any supplies that might reach the walls. Late each afternoon, the silence was broken by shouts of intimidation and threats from the barbarian warriors, aimed directly at the citizens of Jarnvik. As the people faced the terror of the siege, Leif stood firm. Though he felt the weight of responsibility, he knew that Jarnvik's survival depended on his leadership and his ability to think beyond his fear. He spent long hours in the palace halls, meeting with the city's advisors and veteran soldiers. Together, they analyzed the defenses of the walls, inventoried resources, and discussed strategies for withstanding the siege. In between these meetings, Leif walked the streets of the city, speaking directly to the people. He listened to their fears and promised that, under his leadership, Jarnvik would hold. His presence was a source of hope, even to those who doubted. He encouraged the craftsmen to reinforce the barricades, the hunters to help ration supplies, and the warriors to keep a constant vigil. Leif also spent entire nights studying ancient maps of the kingdom and the records left by his ancestors. He drew inspiration from how kings of old had defended Jarnvik against invaders. Among the legends, he found accounts of how the city walls had repelled much larger armies and how the courage of a leader could turn the tide of war. These stories fueled his determination and helped him plan. In the dead of night on the 5th day, as the barbarians continued their provocations, Leif organized groups of warriors to patrol the most vulnerable points of the walls. He instructed archers to reinforce their positions and sent out scouts to observe the enemy's movements. The city's carpenters worked tirelessly to build makeshift defenses and reinforce the gates. At the same time, Leif decided to use psychology against the enemy itself. He ordered additional fires to be lit on the walls during the night, creating the illusion that there were more soldiers in the city than there actually were. He also organized small, stealthy attacks on the enemy lines, burning provisions and cutting off their water routes. These attacks were not enough to stop the barbarians, but they created tension and discomfort among them. During the rare moments of silence, Leif allowed himself to reflect. He knew that his courage would be tested in ways he had never imagined. The responsibility of protecting Jarnvik and fulfilling his destiny weighed heavily on him, but it also motivated him. He thought about his journey here, how the artifact and the crown had chosen him, and he felt that there was something greater at stake than simply the survival of the city. On the 7th day, as he watched the dawn from the top of the walls, Leif saw Thrain's army increase its movements. It was clear that the moment of attack was near. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and prepared himself for the challenge that lay ahead. Jarnvik was ready to fight, and Leif knew that the coming battle would not only be a test of strength, but of strategy, courage, and leadership. The siege had reached its climax, and Jarnvik's fate would soon be decided. The first light of dawn was cutting through the gray sky of Jarnvik, painting the walls with an almost illusory golden hue. The oppressive silence of the 7-day siege finally gave way to a distinct sound, drums. Low, rhythmic, like a colossal heart beating in unison with Thrain's barbarian troops. It was the announcement that the battle was about to begin. From the top of the walls, Leif watched. His face carried the seriousness of a leader aware of what was at stake, but his eyes shone with determination. Jarnvik's defenders, although not seasoned soldiers, were positioned with precision thanks to the strategies devised during the siege. Leif had used every moment of the 7 days to train the citizens, reinforce the defenses, and set traps along the inner perimeter. The silence until now was more than a respite. It was part of a plan. The barbarians advanced like a wild wave, their fierce shouts echoing through the surrounding valleys. The imposing and sturdy walls of Jarnvik were the first obstacle. Thrain, relying on the brute strength of his army, ordered scouts with heavy shields and battering rams to attack the main gates. They moved like a phalanx, protected by large shields, while the rest of the troops surrounded other areas, looking for breaches. Leif's orders echoed from within the city. Archers, position! With a signal, a rain of arrows descended upon the barbarians. The arrows, set ablaze with oil, were fired in a coordinated rhythm. The front of the barbarian formation was immediately disorganized, and the battering ram, still far from the gates, was abandoned. However, the barbarians did not retreat. Shouting in their ancient language, they advanced with greater force. "Prepare the tar," Leif ordered. Atop the walls, huge metal cauldrons were tipped over, pouring boiling tar onto the enemy. The sticky liquid, burning like liquid fire, created a barrier of chaos and destruction. The barbarians' screams of pain echoed, but Thrain, impassive, simply watched from his black horse, waiting for the right moment to act. Leif's defenses were ingenious. In addition to the walls, he had positioned mobile barricades at the most vulnerable points of the city, surrounded by sharp spears made of local wood. These barriers not only slowed the invaders, but also created a narrow field that forced the barbarians to attack in smaller numbers. Inside the city, the civilians who were not fighting were organized into groups. Some tended to the wounded, while others reinforced the barricades or carried ammunition for the archers. Even children and the elderly found ways to help, maintaining an atmosphere of unity that strengthened morale. Leif walked among the defenders, lifting their spirits with firm words. Jarnvik has never fallen, and today will be no different. Each of you is part of this victory. Remember, our strength lies in unity. His words spread like wildfire. The men and women of the city, though frightened, were determined to protect their home. When the barbarians finally managed to bring the battering ram close to the gates, Leif sprung another trap. He had ordered huge boulders to be piled up on the inner sides of the walls. At the signal from his guards, these boulders were released, falling like an avalanche onto the battering ram-wielding barbarians. Once again, the invaders were repelled. The gates remained intact, but Thrain seemed unfazed. He was a strategist as much as a brutal warrior, and Leif knew that the barbarian leader was testing the defenses, searching for weak points. From atop one of the towers, Leif watched the barbarians retreat temporarily. They left behind bodies and destroyed equipment, but in the distance, more troops were regrouping. He knew that this was only the beginning. Within the walls, the citizens celebrated their initial victory, but Leif reminded them that the battle was far from over. Don't let your guard down. They will return, and they will return stronger. We must prepare for what is to come. Despite the warning, he took the opportunity to personally thank many of the defenders. He saw courage in the eyes of those who, days before, had doubted their own abilities. Every small victory strengthened the people's morale, and that was as important as the walls that protected them. As night fell, the archers remained alert, watching for any movement in the barbarian camp. The exhausted people of Jarnvik still found the strength to prepare for the next day. The wounded were tended to, the traps were reinforced, and the supplies were redistributed. In the dead of night, Leif climbed alone to one of the highest towers to observe the horizon. The torches of the barbarian camp looked like distant stars, and he knew that, despite the success of the first attack, Thrain would not give up so easily. He reflected on the weight of his position as king and how much the survival of his people depended on him. Below, the city slept in vigil, every soul ready to face the next attack. Silence reigned again, but this time, it was not a silence of terror. It was the calm of a city that, even under siege, had hope. The first attack had been repelled perfectly, but the war was only just beginning. The full moon hung in the sky like a silent witness as Leif walked through the streets of Jarnvik, now filled with attentive defenders. The initial victory had shown the people that it was possible to resist, but Leif knew that resistance alone would not be enough. It was time to take the initiative. The young king, with his sharp mind, had spent the last few days studying the barbarians, their habits, their weaknesses, and their vulnerabilities. It was then that he had a bold idea, to attack the barbarians not only with weapons, but with intelligence and cunning. During the days of siege, Leif dedicated himself to something unusual for a warrior, the creation of a deadly poison. Inspired by the ancient books found in the library of Jarnvik, he learned about plants and herbs in the region with toxic properties. With the help of Helga, one of the city elders who knew the secrets of the forests, Leif produced a lethal substance capable of killing instantly upon ingestion. It was a colorless and tasteless liquid, ideal for a stealthy attack. The idea was simple in theory, but risky in practice. Leif knew that the barbarian army depended on its vast supply infrastructure to maintain its strength. Their cauldrons of food and barrels of water were central to the group's survival. If they could poison these supplies, they could destabilize the enemy without having to face Thrain's brutal force directly. Leif summoned a group of experienced scouts, men and women who knew the terrain around the city like the back of their hands. They were the most skilled at moving undetected, and they were essential to the execution of the plan. Among them were Gunnar, a skilled hunter, and Astrid, a young woman who had been trained in the shadows of the woods. On the chosen night, Leif gathered the group and shared the final details of the plan. In a firm but calm voice, he said, "The fate of Jarnvik depends on us. You are the invisible blade that will cut through Thrain's strength. Move like shadows, leave no traces, and remember, every second counts." The group set off in the dead of dawn. The shadows of the night were their allies, and each step was carefully calculated to avoid attracting attention. The barbarians, confident in their numerical superiority, kept their patrols scattered, which made it easier for the scouts to advance. Gunnar led the group, his sharp senses picking up on any movement, while Astrid carried the bags of poison. The barbarian camp was a maze of tents and unlit campfires, with soldiers scattered in small groups, some on watch, but many resting. The cauldrons of food were centralized, and the barrels of water were positioned at strategic points. The heart of the camp was within reach, but every movement had to be flawless. Gunnar signaled for the group to split up. Each scout was given a task. Some would take care of the food cauldrons, while others would focus on the water barrels. Astrid, with steady, precise hands, began pouring the poison into the cauldrons. The liquid mixed with the food without leaving a trace. Gunnar, in turn, discreetly opened the barrels and repeated the process, ensuring that the water was contaminated. The tension was palpable. The barbarians could wake up at any moment, and any mistake would be fatal. At one point, one of the scouts heard footsteps nearby. The group froze, each holding their breath. A barbarian soldier, apparently suspicious, passed close to where they were hiding. He looked around, but seeing nothing, he continued on his way. The group continued their task, this time with even more caution. In less than an hour, the mission was completed. The scouts retreated as skillfully as they had entered, disappearing into the shadows and returning to the walls of Jarnvik. Upon arrival, they were greeted by Leif, who was waiting anxiously. Gunnar nodded his head in confirmation of the success of the mission. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, the barbarian camp began to come to life. The soldiers, unaware of what had happened, began their morning routines. The cooks distributed portions of food from the poisoned cauldrons, and the soldiers filled their canteens with water from the contaminated barrels. Slowly, the tragedy began to unfold. The first signs were subtle, soldiers suddenly falling, clutching their stomachs, with expressions of pain and panic. Within minutes, chaos engulfed the camp. Screams of agony echoed, and many fell dead before they even understood what was happening. Some tried to run, but their bodies succumbed to the poison before they could get far. The scene was devastating. Freyne, in his tent, was quickly informed of what was happening. His fury was evident, but even he could not ignore the impact of the tragedy. Within hours, the barbarian army had lost a significant portion of its strength, and the morale of the survivors was in ruins. From the top of the walls, Leif and his men watched the events unfold. Despite the tension of the previous night, they now felt a wave of relief. The plan had worked. Leif, however, did not celebrate. He knew that, although he had inflicted a devastating blow, Freyne would not retreat so easily. By dusk, the remaining barbarians began to retreat, reorganizing their forces into a more defensive position. Freyne, with his somber gaze, knew that a new strategy was needed. The young king, on the other hand, began to plan his next move, aware that the battle was far from over. Jarnvik had gained a day of peace, but the war was not yet decided. As the barbarian camp recovered from the deadly poison, Leif knew that hesitation could be fatal. It was time to take advantage of the enemy's confusion and demoralization to deliver the final blow. During the night, as the moon shone brightly over Jarnvik, he gathered his war council and his best captains. Today, we end this siege. There will be no tomorrow for Thrain and his barbarians. Jarnvik will be free again, and the blood we spill will be the foundation of our peace. Inspired by the courage and determination of their young king, his men pounded their fists against their shields, ready for battle. Leif devised a simple but effective plan: attack the barbarians from all sides, forcing them to retreat into the forests, where they would be cornered and defeated. The Jarnvik army marched out of the walls at the first ray of sunlight. Equipped with newly forged weapons and led by Leif, the soldiers were ready to fight for their families and lands. At the front, Leif carried the Jarnvik banner, a symbol of resistance and hope. The barbarians, still weakened by the poison, tried to organize a defensive line, but they were disoriented. Freyne, the barbarian leader, barked orders, trying to regain control, but his strength no longer inspired the same fear. Leif divided his troops into 3 groups. The first would attack head-on, the second would flank them to the west, and the third would set fire to the enemy's provisions and tents, creating even more chaos. The clash began with a frontal charge led by Leif. His sword gleaming in the sunlight, he cut through the barbarians with precision and strength. At his side, Gunnar, the hunter, and Astrid, now a respected warrior, fought bravely. On the other side, the flanking group caught the barbarians from behind, while the burning tents sent thick smoke into the air. The chaos was absolute. The barbarians, disorganized and outnumbered, began to retreat. Freyne, realizing the imminent defeat, decided to face Leif directly. The barbarian advanced with his huge blade, his screams echoing like thunder. Leif, with cold blood, prepared for the duel. Thrain was a giant, his physical strength overwhelming. He attacked with powerful blows that could split a shield in half. Leif, however, relied on his agility and intelligence. He dodged the attacks and watched Thrain's movements, looking for an opening. Finally, after a heavy blow from Thrain left his guard open, Leif saw his chance. With a swift movement, he delivered a clean blow to the barbarian's leg, sending him to his knees. "Your reign of terror ends here," Leif said, before plunging his sword into Thrain's heart, ending the conflict once and for all. With the death of their leader, the remaining barbarians panicked. Many fled into the forests, while others were captured by Jarnvik's forces. The battle was over, and victory belonged to Leif and his people. Jarnvik's central square became a stage for celebration and relief. The bells rang out, and the citizens, once haunted by fear, now celebrated their freedom. In the days that followed, Leif began the process of rebuilding. He visited every corner of the city, personally helping the wounded, overseeing the rebuilding of the walls, and ensuring that peace was restored. Leif became a widely admired leader, known not only for his courage in battle, but for his compassion and dedication to his people. Under his rule, Jarnvik flourished. The wounds of war began to heal, and the city became a symbol of resilience and prosperity. As the sun set over the horizon, Leif surveyed his city from the top of the walls. He knew that although peace had been achieved, the world was unpredictable and full of challenges. Today we begin a new era for Jarnvik. May this peace be long, and may our stories inspire future generations. With a deep sigh, Leif stepped down from the walls and walked to the square, where the people waited for him to celebrate another night. Jarnvik was free, and its king was ready to lead it to a bright future. And so began the rule of peace and prosperity through Leif's leadership. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.